The morning of June 23, 1944, dawned gray and humid across the marshy forests surrounding Vitebsk, where Obergefreiter Klaus Weber of the 206th Infantry Division's reconnaissance battalion crouched in a waterlogged observation post, scanning the Soviet lines through his Zeiss binoculars. At 25, Weber had been fighting on the Eastern Front for nearly 3 years, surviving the initial advance to Moscow, the desperate retreat from Stalingrad, and countless defensive battles that had gradually pushed Army Group Center back toward the borders of the Reich. But nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for the magnitude of Soviet preparations that he was documenting in the pre-dawn darkness beyond the German forward positions. The 206th Infantry Division held a 15-kilometer sector of the Vitebsk salient as part of the LII Army Corps, defending positions that had been fortified during 6 months of relative stability along the central portion of the Eastern Front. Weber's reconnaissance battalion operated forward observation posts that monitored Soviet activity in the dense forests and swamplands east of the city, providing early warning of enemy preparations and movement. The systematic intelligence gathering had revealed ominous signs of massive Soviet buildup during the past 2 weeks, suggesting preparations for offensive operations that would dwarf previous attacks against Army Group Center. The strategic situation facing Army Group Center in June 1944 reflected the broader deterioration of German fortunes following 3 years of continuous warfare against the Soviet Union. General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch commanded approximately 580,000 German troops organized into the 4th Army, 9th Army, and 3rd Panzer Army, defending a front that stretched nearly 700 kilometers from the Baltic coast to the Pripyat marshes. The Wehrmacht forces lacked adequate reserves, modern equipment, and air support necessary to counter major Soviet offensive operations, while Hitler's insistence on holding fixed positions eliminated tactical flexibility that might have compensated for material disadvantages. Weber's observation post overlooked a section of the Dwina River where Soviet engineers had been conducting suspicious nighttime activities for the past week. His reports documented the systematic construction of pontoon bridges, forward ammunition dumps, and concealed artillery positions that suggested preparations for river-crossing operations on an unprecedented scale. The 206th Infantry Division's intelligence section had compiled similar reports from reconnaissance units throughout the Corps sector, painting a picture of Soviet preparations that indicated imminent offensive operations. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner commanded the Reconnaissance Battalion's 2nd Company, responsible for monitoring Soviet activity across a 5-kilometer front between Vitebsk and the Dwina River. Steiner was a veteran officer who had served with reconnaissance units since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, accumulating extensive experience in intelligence gathering and small unit operations behind enemy lines. His professional assessment of Soviet preparations suggested that the Red Army was implementing the most extensive offensive buildup witnessed on the Eastern Front since the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The Soviet forces concentrating opposite Army Group Center represented the strategic reserve of the Red Army, including multiple Guards Tank Corps, Mechanized Corps, and shock armies that had been secretly relocated from other sectors during the spring of 1944. The 3rd Belorussian Front under General Ivan Cherniakovsky and 2nd Belorussian Front under General Georgy Zakharov commanded over 12 million troops supported by 4,000 tanks and 24,000 artillery pieces. The massive concentration of combat power represented the largest Soviet force assembled for a single operation since the beginning of the war. Operation Bagration, named after the Russian general killed fighting Napoleon in 1812, aimed to destroy Army Group Center completely while liberating Belarus and advancing toward the Baltic coast. Soviet planners had studied German defensive positions extensively, identifying weak points in the Wehrmacht's overextended line that could be exploited through coordinated breakthrough operations. The systematic preparation included extensive deception measures designed to conceal the true scale and timing of the offensive from German intelligence. Weber documented the first concrete signs of imminent Soviet attack at 0347 hours when his observation post detected the distinctive sound of T-34 tanks moving into assembly areas approximately 3 kilometers east of his position. The mechanical noise of tracked vehicles, muffled by the dense forest but unmistakably recognizable to experienced soldiers, suggested that armored formations were positioning themselves for assault operations. Weber's combat experience enabled him to estimate the size of Soviet armored concentrations based on engine sounds and movement patterns observed through his optical equipment. The 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, represented the primary exploitation force for Operation Bagration's northern wing, tasked with breakthrough operations against the 3rd Panzer Army's positions near Vitebsk. The formation included over 700 T-34/85 medium tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks supported by self-propelled artillery and mechanized infantry. Rotmistrov was a veteran tank commander who had distinguished himself during the Battle of Kursk, developing tactical expertise in large-scale armored operations that would prove decisive during the breakthrough phase of Operation Bagration. The German defensive positions around Vitebsk reflected 3 years of continuous fortification efforts, with multiple defensive lines connected by communication trenches and protected by extensive minefields and wire obstacles. The 206th Infantry Division sector included reinforced bunkers, anti-tank positions, and artillery observation posts that provided overlapping fields of fire across likely Soviet approach routes. However, the defensive works were designed to counter limited attacks rather than sustained assault by multiple armies supported by overwhelming artillery concentrations. Hauptmann Steiner reviewed intelligence reports at 0:15 hours, recognizing that the accumulated evidence pointed toward imminent Soviet offensive operations on a scale that would overwhelm German defensive capabilities. The systematic nature of enemy preparations suggested coordinated planning involving multiple front commands, while the concentration of armored and mechanized forces indicated breakthrough operations designed to achieve strategic rather than tactical objectives. Steiner understood that his reconnaissance battalion faced annihilation if caught in their forward positions when the Soviet offensive commenced. The 4th Army, commanded by General der Infanterie Kurt von Tippelskirch, defended the central portion of Army Group Center's front with 12 infantry divisions spread across a 180-kilometer sector. The Army lacked adequate armored reserves and mobile artillery necessary to counter major breakthrough operations, while ammunition shortages and fuel rationing limited the effectiveness of available weapon systems. Tippelskirch recognized that his forces could conduct effective defense only against limited Soviet attacks, but Wehrmacht doctrine required holding fixed positions regardless of tactical circumstances. Weber's observation post came under systematic Soviet artillery reconnaissance at 0:430 hours when enemy forward observers began calling down ranging shots on German positions throughout the reconnaissance battalion's sector. The precision and coordination of the artillery fires suggested that Soviet forces possessed detailed intelligence about German defensive positions, while the systematic nature of the bombardment indicated preparation for major assault operations. Weber recognized that enemy artillery was registering targets for the massive barrage that would precede the main offensive. The Soviet artillery preparation for Operation Bagration included over 24,000 guns and mortars concentrated against Army Group Center's defensive positions, representing the largest artillery concentration in military history. The bombardment plan called for systematic destruction of German communication systems, command posts, and defensive positions over a 4-hour period, followed by rolling barges to support infantry and armored assaults. Soviet gunners had studied German defensive layouts for weeks, preparing precise fire plans that addressed every significant target in the Army Group Center sector. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Müller, commanding the 206th Infantry Division's artillery regiment, attempted to coordinate counter-battery fires against detected Soviet gun positions, but the overwhelming numerical superiority of enemy artillery made effective suppression impossible. The German forces possessed approximately 800 artillery pieces in the entire Army Group Center sector, compared to over 24,000 Soviet guns concentrated for Operation Bagration. The mathematical disparity eliminated any possibility of achieving fire superiority or effectively disrupting Soviet preparations. Weber documented additional signs of imminent attack when Soviet reconnaissance aircraft began systematic photographic missions over German positions at 0500 hours. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft operated with impunity due to the absence of effective German air defense, enabling detailed observation of Wehrmacht defensive preparations and troop dispositions. The aerial reconnaissance provided Soviet commanders with comprehensive intelligence about German capabilities and vulnerabilities that would be exploited during the offensive operations. The Luftwaffe's Eastern Front forces had been reduced to fewer than 60 operational aircraft opposing Operation Bagration, compared to over 2,400 Soviet aircraft assigned to support the offensive. The overwhelming Soviet air superiority eliminated German reconnaissance capabilities while providing close air support for Red Army ground operations. The systematic destruction of German air power during the previous 2 years had created tactical conditions that favored Soviet offensive operations while limiting Wehrmacht defensive options. Oberst Wilhelm Hoffmann, commanding the 206th Infantry Division, received fragmentary intelligence reports from subordinate units throughout the morning, recognizing that his division faced assault by overwhelming Soviet forces within hours rather than days. Hoffmann was a veteran infantry officer who had commanded regiment and division-level units throughout the Eastern Front campaign, but his tactical knowledge suggested that the German defensive positions could not withstand coordinated attack by multiple Soviet armies. The systematic enemy preparations exceeded anything witnessed during previous phases of the war. The breakdown of German intelligence capabilities during the final phase of Army Group Center's existence reflected broader problems affecting Wehrmacht operations throughout the Eastern Front. The destruction of experienced reconnaissance units, elimination of air support, and breakdown of communication systems had created intelligence gaps that prevented accurate assessment of Soviet capabilities and intentions. The systematic German intelligence failure contributed directly to the tactical surprise achieved during Operation Bagration's opening phase. Weber observed the final preparations for Soviet assault operations at 0530 hours when enemy forces began moving assault troops into forward positions under cover of morning fog. The systematic movement of infantry, engineers, and supporting weapons suggested that Soviet commanders were implementing carefully rehearsed procedures for river crossing operations under fire. The professional competence displayed by Red Army units contrasted sharply with the confused defensive preparations evident in German positions. The 39th Guards Rifle Corps, assigned to the initial assault across the Dwina River, included 3 experienced rifle divisions supported by engineer battalions, assault guns, and rocket artillery. The formation had participated in previous breakthrough operations at Stalingrad and Kursk, accumulating tactical expertise in river crossing operations and urban warfare. The Guards designation reflected elite status within the Red Army, with units receiving priority equipment and experienced personnel. The German 206th Infantry Division's defensive plan called for destroying Soviet forces during their river crossing attempt, using overlapping fields of fire from prepared positions to create killing zones in the water and on the opposite bank. However, the plan depended on maintaining communication between defensive positions and coordinating supporting fires during the chaos of battle. The systematic Soviet artillery preparation had already begun degrading German communication systems while neutralizing many defensive positions. Hauptmann Steiner made the decision at 0545 hours to withdraw his forward observation posts before they became trapped by the advancing Soviet assault, recognizing that the reconnaissance battalion's survival depended on avoiding encirclement during the initial enemy breakthrough. The tactical situation facing forward German units reflected the broader strategic reality that Army Group Center lacked sufficient reserves and firepower to counter Operation Bagration effectively. Steiner's professional judgment suggested that German forces faced systematic destruction rather than tactical defeat. The Soviet offensive commenced at exactly 0600 hours on June 23, 1944, when over 24,000 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across the entire Army Group Center front. The thunderous bombardment could be heard 50 kilometers away as high-explosive shells systematically destroyed German defensive positions that had been prepared during months of relative stability. Weber's observation post disappeared in the first salvo as Soviet gunners demonstrated the precision that resulted from extensive preparation and reconnaissance. The artillery preparation for Operation Bagration continued for 4 hours with mathematical precision, as Soviet batteries delivered pre-planned fires against every significant German position identified through intelligence gathering and aerial reconnaissance. The systematic destruction of communication systems, command posts, and defensive works eliminated German coordination capabilities while preparing the way for infantry and armored assaults. The overwhelming firepower concentration represented the culmination of Soviet learning from 3 years of warfare against Wehrmacht forces. Weber survived the initial bombardment by taking shelter in a reinforced dugout constructed during the winter defensive preparations, but the systematic destruction of his unit's positions eliminated any possibility of effective reconnaissance operations. The surviving members of the reconnaissance battalion attempted to withdraw toward the main defensive line, but Soviet artillery fires had created impassable crater fields while severing communication with higher headquarters. The tactical situation reflected the broader breakdown of German defensive coordination throughout the Army Group Center sector. The first Soviet infantry assault across the Dwina River commenced at 1000 hours when elements of the 39th Guards Rifle Corps began crossing operations using assault boats and improvised rafts under cover of intense artillery fires. The German defensive positions that survived the preliminary bombardment engaged the crossing attempts with small arms and automatic weapons, but the overwhelming numbers of attacking troops made effective defense impossible. Soviet engineers quickly established pontoon bridges to support follow-up forces and heavy equipment. Lieutenant General Alexei Gorbatov, commanding the Third Army of the Third Belarusian Front, coordinated the breakthrough operations against the Vitebsk salient with methodical precision. Gorbatov was an experienced commander who had survived Stalin's purges and demonstrated tactical competence during defensive operations against German forces. His systematic approach to breakthrough operations reflected improved Soviet doctrine that emphasized coordination between different arms and services. Weber witnessed the systematic collapse of German defensive positions as Soviet forces established multiple bridgeheads across the Dwina River while advancing through gaps created by the artillery preparation. The 206th Infantry Division's defensive line disintegrated rapidly under coordinated assault by overwhelming enemy forces supported by close air support and artillery fires. The tactical situation confirmed Weber's assessment that Army Group Center faced systematic destruction rather than temporary tactical setbacks. The 5th Guards Tank Army began crossing the Dwina River at 1200 hours using heavy pontoon bridges constructed by Soviet engineer units under artillery protection. The appearance of T-34/85 tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks in the German rear areas marked the transition from breakthrough to exploitation operations. Weber recognized that the presence of Soviet armored formations behind German defensive positions meant that his division and the entire LII Army Corps faced encirclement and annihilation. Oberst Hoffmann attempted to coordinate counterattacks using his division's reserve battalion, but the breakdown of communication systems and overwhelming Soviet firepower made effective coordination impossible. The 206th Infantry Division possessed no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet heavy tanks, while the absence of German air support eliminated any possibility of disrupting enemy exploitation operations. Hoffmann's tactical experience suggested that his division could not survive sustained assault by multiple Soviet armies. The systematic encirclement of Vitebsk developed rapidly as Soviet armored spearheads advanced around both flanks of the city, while maintaining pressure against German forces, attempting to hold the urban areas. The 1st Tank Corps and 6th Guards Mechanized Corps penetrated German rear areas with minimal resistance, cutting communication lines and supply routes that connected the Vitebsk garrison with the remainder of Army Group Center. The speed and coordination of Soviet operations demonstrated tactical competence that exceeded German expectations. Weber and the survivors of his reconnaissance battalion attempted to fight their way through Soviet encirclement forces, but the overwhelming enemy superiority in numbers and equipment made successful breakout impossible. The systematic deployment of Soviet blocking positions demonstrated operational planning that anticipated German escape attempts while preventing the evacuation of experienced personnel and equipment. Weber's survival depended on individual skills and luck rather than unit coordination or superior equipment. General der Infanterie Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding the 3rd Panzer Army, recognized that his forces faced systematic destruction as Soviet breakthrough operations eliminated defensive positions throughout his sector. Reinhardt attempted to coordinate withdrawal operations that would preserve some combat capability, but Hitler's insistence on holding fixed positions eliminated tactical flexibility while ensuring maximum casualties. The 3rd Panzer Army's annihilation demonstrated the consequences of strategic inflexibility in modern warfare. The encirclement of Vitebsk was completed on June 25 when Soviet armored spearheads linked up west of the city, trapping approximately 35,000 German troops in an inescapable pocket. The systematic nature of Soviet operations demonstrated operational planning that addressed both breakthrough and exploitation phases of the offensive. The German forces trapped in Vitebsk faced annihilation without hope of relief or evacuation, as Army Group Center lacked reserves necessary for rescue operations. Weber escaped the Vitebsk encirclement by joining a small group of survivors who abandoned their equipment and attempted to reach German lines on foot through forest terrain unsuitable for Soviet mechanized forces. The march lasted 8 days through hostile territory, dominated by Soviet forces and partisan units that controlled most of the rural areas in Belarus. Weber's survival demonstrated individual resourcefulness and combat experience, but his escape could not change the broader tactical situation facing Army Group Center. The destruction of the Fourth Army occurred simultaneously with the Vitebsk encirclement as Soviet forces penetrated German defensive positions east of Orsha and Mogilev. The 33rd Army and 49th Army of the Second Belarusian Front advanced through gaps created by overwhelming artillery preparation, eliminating German defensive positions with systematic precision. The Fourth Army's remnants attempted fighting withdrawals toward the Berezina River, but Soviet mobile forces maintained contact while preventing consolidation of secondary defensive positions. General der Infanterie Kurt von Tippelskirch attempted to coordinate Fourth Army withdrawal operations, but the systematic breakdown of communication systems and overwhelming Soviet pressure made effective command and control impossible. The Army's infantry divisions disintegrated under sustained assault by multiple Soviet corps supported by overwhelming artillery and air support. Tippelskirch's professional competence could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages facing German forces during Operation Bagration. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army advanced over 200 kilometers during the first week of Operation Bagration, demonstrating the effectiveness of breakthrough and exploitation operations conducted by experienced armored formations. General Rotmistrov's systematic approach to mobile warfare reflected improved Soviet doctrine that emphasized rapid advance to operational objectives while maintaining coordination between different combat arms. The Tank Army's success validated Red Army tactical development during 3 years of warfare against German forces. Weber reached German positions west of Minsk on July 2, reporting the systematic destruction of Army Group Center to intelligence officers who were already documenting the magnitude of Soviet success throughout the Eastern Front. His first-hand observations of Soviet tactical competence and overwhelming material superiority confirmed assessments that Operation Bagration represented a fundamental shift in the balance of military power. Weber's survival provided valuable intelligence about Red Army capabilities and tactical procedures. The liberation of Minsk on July 3, 1944, marked the completion of Operation Bagration's first phase, with Soviet forces advancing over 450 kilometers in 11 days while destroying the majority of Army Group Center's combat strength. The systematic Soviet success eliminated approximately 350,000 German troops while capturing vast quantities of military equipment and supplies. The operational results exceeded even optimistic Soviet projections while demonstrating the Red Army's evolution into a professional military force capable of conducting complex operations. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating the overall Soviet offensive as Stalin's representative, recognized that Operation Bagration's success validated fundamental changes in Red Army doctrine and organization that had occurred since the disasters of 1941. The systematic coordination between multiple front commands, effective integration of different combat arms, and successful deception operations demonstrated Soviet learning from 3 years of warfare against Wehrmacht forces. Zhukov's strategic oversight contributed to operational success that would influence subsequent Soviet offensives. The strategic implications of Army Group Center's destruction extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence the broader course of World War II in Europe. The systematic elimination of German combat power in Belarus created opportunities for subsequent Soviet offensives toward the Baltic states and Poland, while forcing Wehrmacht strategic reserves to cover gaps in the Eastern Front. The Red Army's demonstrated capability for conducting major offensive operations influenced Allied planning for operations in Western Europe. Weber spent the remainder of 1944 serving with hastily organized replacement units attempting to establish defensive positions along the East Prussian border. But the systematic Soviet advances made effective defense increasingly difficult. His combat experience and knowledge of Soviet tactical procedures made him valuable for training new soldiers, while his survival provided continuity with the experienced personnel lost during Operation Bagration. Weber's subsequent service illustrated the individual resilience that characterized German forces despite strategic defeat. The tactical lessons learned during Operation Bagration influenced Soviet military doctrine for subsequent operations against German forces and post-war development of armored warfare concepts. The systematic coordination between artillery, infantry, and armored forces demonstrated effective combined arms operations, while the successful deception measures validated operational security procedures. The Red Army's learning from 3 years of warfare had produced tactical competence that exceeded German capabilities despite continued individual heroism by Wehrmacht personnel. The human cost of Operation Bagration included approximately 450,000 German casualties during the 3-week operation, representing the systematic destruction of Army Group Center as an effective fighting force. The Soviet success eliminated 28 German divisions while capturing hundreds of senior officers and thousands of experienced non-commissioned officers whose knowledge would have been valuable for defensive operations. The magnitude of personnel losses exceeded German replacement capabilities while demonstrating the consequences of strategic inflexibility. The intelligence failure that contributed to Army Group Center's destruction reflected broader problems affecting German strategic assessment and operational planning during 1944. The systematic underestimation of Soviet capabilities combined with overconfidence in German defensive positions created conditions that enabled the Red Army to achieve tactical surprise despite obvious preparation indicators. The intelligence breakdown demonstrated the importance of accurate assessment and realistic planning in military operations. Weber's recognition that Army Group Center was doomed when he observed Soviet tanks crossing the Dwina River proved accurate, as the systematic German collapse during Operation Bagration eliminated effective resistance throughout Belarus within 3 weeks. His intuitive understanding of the tactical situation reflected combat experience and professional competence that characterized individual German soldiers despite their unit's strategic disadvantages. The Soviet tank breakthrough at Vitebsk marked the beginning of systematic destruction that would continue until Germany's surrender. The legacy of Operation Bagration extended beyond immediate military considerations to influence post-war military doctrine and strategic analysis of modern warfare. The systematic Soviet success demonstrated the importance of overwhelming material superiority, effective operational planning, and coordinated execution in contemporary military operations. The Red Army's tactical competence validated 3 years of learning from combat against German forces while establishing principles that would influence military development for decades. The destruction of Army Group Center represented the largest tactical defeat suffered by German forces during World War II, exceeding even the Stalingrad disaster in terms of personnel and equipment losses. The systematic nature of Soviet success demonstrated Red Army evolution from the disorganized force of 1941 into a professional military organization capable of conducting complex operations against experienced opponents. The operational results validated Soviet strategic planning while confirming the fundamental shift in military capabilities that characterized the war's final phase. Weber's survival of Operation Bagration enabled him to witness the systematic collapse of German resistance on the Eastern Front during the final year of World War II. His combat experience provided perspective on the evolution of warfare that had occurred during 3 years of conflict, while his observations documented the human dimension of strategic defeat. Weber's personal story represented thousands of individual experiences during the systematic destruction of Army Group Center, illustrating both the horror and futility of continued resistance against overwhelming odds. The morning of June 23, 1944, when Weber first observed Soviet tanks positioning for assault operations east of Vitebsk, marked the beginning of the end for German forces on the Eastern Front. The systematic preparation and execution of Operation Bagration demonstrated Soviet tactical competence that would prove decisive during subsequent operations toward Berlin. Weber's recognition that Army Group Center was doomed reflected the reality that individual courage and professional skill could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages facing German forces during the war's final phase.